Now, I don't need to tell you that we live in an uncertain world. You already know that. The question you're asking yourself every day is, how did we get here? Well, sit back and relax, stranger. I'm going to tell you. Now, let me get the old historical simulator booted up here. That's mighty strange. Picture's not looking too hot. Let's see what I can do about that. Come on. Come on, you old piece of junk. Ah, there we go. That's a little better. Give her a minute to warm up. Now, way back in the beginning, there was Vienna. Don't get too antsy about the speed here. Reliable sources tell me that Vienna waits for you. Needless to say, this city was an ambitious one. A little family called the Habsburgs had gathered the local barbarians in one place, slapped down a few mud huts, and started putting on airs. And this civilization thing turned out to be catching. It wasn't long before Vienna grew from a ramshackle collection of riverside huts into a veritable village. Not long after that, the Habsburgs started sending people out to see what was what in the wider world. Well, to begin with, they found an awful lot of shiny things sticking out of rocks and started trying to figure out just how to get at them. This would keep the people of Vienna busy for quite some time, but in the meanwhile, the citizens had more pressing problems. The discovery of a desiccated corpse of a city much like theirs didn't deter them, and the big old flat-top mountains nearby were cause for celebration because, hey, who doesn't like a giant table? Ah, there we go. Now this set off some kind of chain reaction. It seemed that everyone was trying to get into the civilization game. The Quebecois and Bucharest up north, and of course the mysterious forest-dwelling Iroquois out to the west, and more. There we are, that's Hiawatha, the leader. It'd be a while before they figured out just where those Iroquois lived, but the point was that the race towards civilization dominance was on. Now then, the idea of making everyone think and act in the same way, on penalty of some sort of horrible eternal damnation, was a new idea, one that was discovered later on in the 3000s BC. In fact, it wasn't until the warriors had continued exploring through the area, as you can see, just up there mapping out the edges of Bucharest. Eventually, the idea came from a different source entirely. Let's just take a look here at Vienna. They were trying to figure out this whole faith thing, this whole religion game, but they didn't have any idea where to start. It took them a little while to get the hang of it, and in the end, it was someone else who gave them the idea to start with. Now, don't mind that tag there. That's not telling you who's really in charge, just the most famous figure. The Habsburgs were a very long-lived dynasty, and they ruled what became the Austrian Empire from its beginning all the way until today, if you can believe it. Yes, it's true. The Habsburgs were clever people, and they still are. Now here we see the first barbarian encampment that the scouts have run into. Fortunately, the barbarians didn't recognize that the scouts were not also barbarians, so they didn't end up getting in a fight. They were pretty safe there. But these ruins down here in the south, they're going to be important in a minute. There we go. An ancient oracle. This is the person who gave them the idea about religion. This new concept that you could control people by fear was one that caught on all over the world, but the Habsburgs took to it like fish to water. Once the Viennese knew how to get shiny rocks out of not shiny rocks and how to turn not shiny rocks into useful structures, they needed people to do all those things for them. And that's how the Labor Corps was born. It was a thankless existence, and in order to keep the workers working, the Habsburgs started trying on some of these religion ideas for size. Once they started putting it into practice, well, it was pretty effective for them. If you work hard for the Habsburg Dynasty, you get eternal joy. If you complain too much, well, into the fires of damnation with you. Now, if we wait here just a moment, we can see the technology tree that shows they'll be working up towards currency, which is something that the Habsburgs discovered eventually. And here we see the Habsburgs trying to figure out just how they want to control their workers. What's the most effective way? Now, we had all kinds of ideas. They could set up religious idols if they had lots of gold and silver, monuments to the gods if they wanted to build lots of huge buildings, and, if they wanted to make their cities safer from barbarians, they could do that too. But eventually, after a long time of debating over the merits and downfalls of each particular pantheon, they decided that the best thing to do was to make people work really, really hard. And this idea was super effective. Soon, the laborers were tirelessly tilling the fields and growing food so that the city of Vienna could stay in one place even when the seasons changed. This is a pretty novel idea, but one that all the other civilizations were trying out too. As Vienna was becoming more settled and successful, and the Habsburgs were growing more and more powerful, the explorers started heading south. Now that they'd mapped out most of the area to the north and west, it seemed logical to go in one of the other cardinal directions. There wasn't much they could find out east, just a bunch of water. And they didn't have any way of dealing with those big lakes quite yet. Now, the embassy there that you saw was Hiawatha trying to sneak people in to Vienna so that he could figure out what was going on there. Now, at first the Habsburgs weren't too sure how this worked, but we'll get to that later. Down in the south, they encountered a whole new civilization, one run by, of all things, a woman. This came as a huge shock, needless to say, as the Habsburgs only allowed men to make decisions. At first, they wanted as little to do with Carthage as possible, and their lack of diplomacy in explaining this to Dido would lead to a lot of troubles down the road. Meanwhile, the people of Vienna were very excited by the discovery of a giant hole, which complemented the giant table they'd found earlier quite nicely. It was a shame that neither one was in their domain quite yet, but the desire to have those things in their lives is something that would color the expansion of the Austrian Empire for generations to come. You can see the explorers are starting to map out the west coast of the main continent of our little story here, and finding more and more civilizations as they go. Ah, there it is, the Beringer Crater. That's the giant hole they were getting so excited about. As you can see, it made the people happier overall. It's in the middle of a giant desert, which not the most hospitable place, but you know, people were just really excited about it, even as they were also figuring out that they could use this brown metal they found in the ground to poke things a whole lot better than they could with their rocks attached to sticks, which they'd been using so far. Now here we see the beginnings of a legend. These scouts running away from those wounded barbarians is going to lead to a rather militaristic legend that we'll talk about once it gets ready. Now, as the barbarians closed in on these intrepid explorers in the south, back home the Habsburgs were introducing new laws and policies which encouraged the people to work harder than ever. Now that they knew how to make buildings, they were eager to build as many of them as possible. A system of reward and punishment for workers sped up the process appreciably, all the while making the Habsburgs wealthier and wealthier. Now, you just saw the first battle in Viennese history, 2640 BC, between the southern scouts and a badly wounded group of barbarian raiders. Barbarians, got taken by surprise. The scouts rolled rocks down on them, then finished them off by beating them the rest of the way to death with sticks. By the time that story had made its way home, the brave scouts had held off a barbarian horde 500 strong with nothing more than their wits in a sheep's bladder. Legend would go on to inspire these warriors of Vienna for millennia to come. As you can see, they're already getting into it with those barbarians. Now later on that year, the first major project began in Vienna, the Great Pyramids. These giant triangular buildings were originally conceived as a resting place for the Habsburgs when they passed on and left the dynasty to their next Habsburg in line. Their heirs, if you will. And simultaneously, the Habsburgs decided that it was time to expand. And so a caravan was commissioned and it was sent north to a bunch of more shiny rocks, and that's how Salzburg was founded. And the new city was immediately beset by bandits and barbarians, but the walls held. In the south, the scouts weren't having quite so much luck. They were being pushed to their limits by the vengeful barbarians, even as the warriors of the north engaged in a battle against superior odds. But, buoyed up by the legend of those southern scouts, they fought bravely and well. You can see these scouts, they're on the run from those barbarians, trying to find some more high ground and see if they can pull off that same trick again. And the people of Salzburg throwing rocks at those barbarians outside their walls because they're not their biggest fans. Scouts getting beaten on, the tables have turned, but they figure if they can just run away fast enough, maybe they'll survive. Here the warriors up north, they're showing what's what. Pretty impressive work that they're doing down there. Those barbarians just aren't giving up, are they? You can see those warriors fighting pretty hard against overwhelming odds, but they are definitely not giving up, no matter what. And Salzburg is defending itself quite ably from those barbarians, something that it would have to do many, many more times in the future, and not always against disorganized barbarian hordes. In fact, shortly we're going to see a whole new level of warfare carried out around the outskirts of Salzburg. Now these scouts still trying to defend their hill. They're doing decently well, and that's allowing them to survive the onslaught of those well-armed barbarians. Now, those warriors up in the north, they're not having quite so much luck, so they figure it's time to retreat back towards Vienna. Heal up, maybe get some reinforcements. They figured they'd hide out in this jungle for a little while, just to make it harder to find themselves. And you can see the world is a busy place in 2240 BC, but there isn't a whole lot that we can focus on until now, when we see these scouts fleeing for their lives. And surely, oh, dang, what do you know? It seems they couldn't walk 5 steps without running into another group of angry barbarians. Fortunately for them, the Carthaginians seem to have a little bit of a feud with this group, as did the Iroquois. Sent out some spearmen armed with those bronze-tipped sticks. Now here, you can see the Salzburg barbarians. They're starting to use some strange new weapons against the city. It's sort of a bent stick tied with string that shot little knives. The Habsburg rulers in Salzburg tried to figure out this bow, and the researchers in Vienna finally started to notice that round things roll better than squares. A whole new world was about to open up for them, but we're going to have to wait to see that. First, let's check in with these scouts and see how they're going to escape their latest predicament. What do you know? It's by running away. As they ran away, they ran into yet another city-state. This one's called Florence. A well-known city-state in the south. And here we see, they finally figured out round things roll better than squares, and a whole new world is opening up to the Viennese as we speak. Now, within the borders of Florence, the scouts defeated a group of barbarians and gained the city-state's favor. They seemed really happy about them exterminating these barbarian hordes, and the Habsburgs started to think, well, maybe we can exploit this. So let's just watch this battle play out first. As you can see, the Viennese were quite busy. Not quite as busy as Carthage, which is going to come into play later on. But these warriors and the city of Salzburg are about to exploit what we are going to learn here in Florence in the next turn. So just watch and see if you can figure out what the Habsburgs also figured out about city-states and them. Go ahead and post in the comments if you can figure it out before it happens. It won't count if you post it afterwards, though. I'll know. I'm a clever guy. There's Vienna expanding its borders, giving its workers more to do. And here we're going to see this big fight play out. These scouts bravely went and beat those barbarians to death, and Florence was really happy about it. So here's where the Habsburgs started to put it together. The warriors of Vienna started to clear out the encampment of the barbarians up near Salzburg, and figuring this would make Quebec and Bucharest very happy, which, as we're seeing here, is exactly what happened. See how happy Quebec and Bucharest are with us. So they exclaimed over the courage and bravery of the Viennese and Salzburg warriors, and the Habsburgs, being clever folk, started to devise a plan to turn the city-states into vassal states through marriage. But those plans had to be on hold while the pyramids were completed. If you'll just wait, we'll see that happen right now. Or maybe in a moment. Warriors taking a well-deserved rest inside the borders of Salzburg. And... no, still nothing. Salzburg started training its own warriors with those weird bow things, and at the same time the pyramids were finally completed, just in time for the latest Habsburg to get interred inside the first one. Everyone was really excited about that, and it inspired the people of Habsburg to work all the harder, and the labor corps doubled in size practically overnight. At this time, a new project was begun. It was the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, where even more famous people would be interred. But this was all made possible by the discovery of a way to manipulate numbers to explain mysteries, which itself was the result of studying one of the captured barbarian bows. Now these bows fired on certain trajectories. Once they could figure out what those trajectories were, a new science, perhaps the first science, was introduced to the Austrian civilization, which at this point was still referred to as the Habsburg holdings. That science, of course, was called... can you guess what it is? Can you? Well, you're probably cheating and looking up in the top left of the screen, but in a little bit they're going to be discovering mathematics, and that's going to be very exciting for them. It'll open up entire new avenues of exploration and discovery for the people of Vienna and Salzburg. For now, let's just enjoy watching these workers industriously creating roads and mines all the way from Vienna up to Salzburg to make trading easier between the two cities of the Habsburg holdings. Those scouts are checking out Carthage, which, as you can see, seems to be arming themselves up pretty hardcore. We're not entirely sure why that was, but it's certainly something worth exploring and thinking about. Now, see if you remember your history very well. Why was Carthage arming itself so heavily at this point in history? I'll give you a hint. It's got something to do with the Habsburgs. And here we go. We're about to discover mathematics, the gate and key to the sciences, according to Roger Bacon. And this opened up a whole new era, quite literally. Now, this was a great time of prosperity for the Habsburg Dynasty, but things were only about to get better. You can see the warriors are heading back. Carthage seems to be taking an undue interest in Salzburg for some reason. But the most important part is that the mausoleum of Halicarnassus was well underway, and the Salzburgs are starting to kit out their warriors with these bows that they reverse engineered from what the barbarians up north had made. Here's where it gets even better. A golden age dawned. People were really thrilled about mathematics. They were really thrilled about all the things that had been accomplished by the Habsburgs. And so the citizens started working harder. The philosophers started thinking deeper, and the merchants started charging more for their goods because, hey, you got a profit. And thanks to the introduction of new social policies, this golden age would last for centuries, the longest one in Austrian history. Not even the barbarians banging at the gates could dampen the spirits of the Habsburg holdings. As you can see, the road to Salzburg is just about to be completed. It's a very exciting time. And the scouts are heading back up north now that they've gone as far south as they can for now. There we go, they're starting to mine those jewels now they've figured out how to do it. And Vienna, under siege from barbarians, but the people don't care. They're very happy. Great things were, taking place for them. They didn't need to worry about starvation most of the time. They didn't need to worry about working too hard unless they were in the labor corps. And they didn't need to worry about dying unless it was of, dysentery. They hadn't quite figured out things like plumbing yet. But they'd get there. See Vienna expanding its influence so that its borders meet up between Vienna and Salzburg. This is an important step for the Habsburg holdings, and one of those that took us closer and closer towards the foundation of the Austrian Empire, which would happen in a few hundred more years. Now, the watermill was a very interesting innovation that they came up with in Salzburg. Harnessing the power of the river and the waterfall there, they started using the watermill to basically make work easier, which was a bit of an alien concept to the Habsburgs. They preferred people to work harder, but all the same, they appreciated the fact that more work was getting done, regardless of whether or not the workers were being suitably kept busy, in their opinion. That road has finally been completed. There's a trade route between Salzburg and Vienna right up through that jungle. It made things very convenient for them, and now they could turn their attention back to mining all the shiny rocks they found all around their empire. Now here we can see them kitting out these warriors with the ranged weapons and sending them after the barbarians. And it was a very effective way of dealing with them. This fighting from a distance thing without getting hurt quite as badly all the time really caught on, and it would be a part of the Habsburg society in terms of warfare for generations to come. People were just really excited about the fact that they could hurt people from a distance without getting hurt so badly in return. There we see these scouts. They were going to rescue those workers just as the venerable mausoleum of Halicarnassus was completed in 1120 BC, right on time for the death of the most recent Habsburg ruler, Albert IV. Albert IV was interred with all due pomp and ceremony, and his son Rudolf took over. Rudolf's first act was to return Zurich's workers to Zurich, all part of his master plan. And then he thought, you know what? I'm going to start carrying out the family's expansionist plans. He had an eldest daughter, Matilda, and that daughter he started basically courting to the ruler of Quebec, Françoise. Françoise, of course, was duly impressed by the beauty and delicacy and intelligence and so on and so forth of Matilda Habsburg. Well, not the intelligence so much. At this point in history, men were still very much terrified of intelligent women. And here we see the marriage between Françoise and Matilda folded Quebec into the Habsburg holdings. At this point, Rudolf declared the holdings to be an empire which he named the Austrian Empire. Right away, Rudolf began molding Quebec into the kind of powerful production house that would define the cities of the Austrian Empire through the years of its rise and rise and rise. Watch there, you can see, is already starting to mold it into basically a primitive factory city as the workers start making them food so that the people in the city will never have to leave. And here we can watch an excellent little battle. You can see these encampments taken away, Hiawatha saying, oh, we're going to be friends forever, which of course is not what happened, as you'll recall from chapter 20. Hiawatha was still sort of very polite. At this point, they were cautiously cordial, as we might say. So the barbarians are dealt with for the time being, and so Rudolf turned his attention to the rival civilizations, which continued to spread to the west and south. Relations continued to be, as we said, cautiously cordial with Hiawatha's band of Iroquois, but there had been no contact with Carthage and Dido since the two civilizations had first met and inevitably pissed each other off. That falling out would be quite a shock for the people of the Austrian Empire, now that they were about to meet Dido's Carthage once more. The researchers in Vienna were also very excited by using all the excess jewels that they had in a brand new enterprise. They started carving the jewels up into little sort of circles with different facets on them, and they were etching Rudolf's face onto those jewels. Now, jewels of different values and different sizes were made into what they called currency, which made trade much more efficient. You didn't have to cart around giant bags of gold and silver. You could simply say, this coin is my promise to you that if you take it to a bank, you can get that much gold and silver. It made everything much more efficient, and the brilliance of its simplicity made Austrian currency the standard all across the continent, well before the Austrian Empire stretched nearly that far. Sadly, shortly after the introduction of currency, Rudolf I died, and a succession of his sons and their sons and their sons continued the work of governing the Austrian Empire. Rudolf, of course, was put into the mausoleum of Halicarnassus along with his forefathers, and everything was wonderful. Now, once the Austrians had devised a way to simplify trade, the next step was to come up with a way to easily track the seasons. Up until now, people had simply been saying it's cold, it must be winter, or it's raining, it must be autumn, or it's super hot, I must be in hell. So, being able to track these in a more organized and efficient way was a big concern of Rudolf's son, also named Rudolf, who was in charge at the time of this discovery. Now, what the researchers in Vienna did was they immediately began inventing a calendar. And what the calendar did was basically track the phases of the moon. And the phases of the moon changed throughout each cycle of 30 or so days, which they called a month. And they gave each month a name. And then each season had a certain number of months within it. And this is basically how people kept track of time. We can see here Vienna was starving a little bit because Rudolf II got a little too overzealous in his attempts to make sure that people were working super hard all the time, but he repented, and he was able to make sure that people had food in about 875 to 850 BC, so that they weren't starving quite so badly anymore. People had enough food, and that was all that really counted. As we can see here, the next wonder is about to be completed, the statue of Zeus. This was patterned on a figure that they had found in those first ruins, the ones of the desiccated civilization that we discussed way back in the beginning. They figured if it worked for that civilization, well, it should work for theirs too. They didn't seem to see this as a bad omen, seeing as that civilization had been destroyed, but, you know, you can't really blame them for getting excited about it. There we go, the calendar. People were pretty psyched about this system. Now they were finally able to keep track of time without just walking outside and saying, how do my joints feel? They were able to come up with this system and say, well, according to the system, it's Thor's Day, or whatever the case may be. Now the Habsburgs, once they had this in place, and the currency in place, and all of these systems to help control their civilization, they figured it was time to put this religion thing into overdrive. Their empire was growing rapidly, it was getting more difficult to control the workers and keep them in their places, and so the Habsburgs and their advisors started devising systems behind the scenes to essentially dominate the common people through the fear of eternal damnation. And this would prove to be extremely effective as a tool of governance throughout the rest of the Habsburg Empire's existence. You see these archers are bravely taking on the spearmen with their pointy bronze sticks. And Vienna starts working on yet another wonder, the Stonehenge, which was based around the idea of, why not take a bunch of giant rocks and stack them together in a weird shape? It could be fun. Now, as you can see, these archers are fighting right on the border of Carthage. And you may also notice that all the soldiers, all the warriors that we saw earlier, aren't anywhere to be seen, whereas they could easily be viewed before. So if you're starting to put things together and noticing the timeline here, then you'll know exactly what's going to happen next. But for now, let's just see what the Austrians do once Lady Dido of Carthage declares war. They made contact once again, and they found what was very distressing. Dido had been harboring resentment against the Habsburgs for centuries, and so she took this excuse to begin ridding the world of the misogynist Habsburg plague, and at first the Austrians laughed it off. A woman waging war against them? Ridiculous. They stopped laughing once the elephants came.